Good evening, my name's Andrew Clapham. I'm a professor here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. A very warm welcome to everybody this evening. We're extremely privileged to have with us tonight the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, Philippe Lazzarini. Welcome. Maybe before I introduce the speaker, I may say just a few words about UNRWA. Founded in 1949, its mandate for the Palestinians expelled or fleeing the violence of 1948 and the subsequent conflicts. The mandate covers Gaza as well, as we will hear, but also the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Palestinians in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. There are millions registered with UNRWA. The work of UNRWA covers education and healthcare. And as I was preparing these remarks this evening, I looked back to the UNRWA Resolution 302 from 1949 that founds UNRWA, the General Assembly. And I noticed that it mentions that there should be continued assistance for the relief of Palestine refugees is necessary to prevent conditions of starvation and distress amongst them and to further conditions of peace and stability. As you know, the hindering of UNRWA has clearly in the last few years been closely associated with the issue of starvation and indeed the distress in Gaza. Now, Mr. Lazzarini is a graduate of the University of Neuchâtel and the University of Lausanne. He's married with 4 children, 3 of whom are here tonight, and welcome Antonia, who's also here. He started his professional career in 1987 as an economist with the canton of Bern in Switzerland. From 1989 to 1999, Mr. Lazzarini worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross and as the deputy head of communications here in Geneva. He then went to the field as the head of delegation in Rwanda, Angola, and Sarajevo, having also worked as an ICRC delegate in southern Sudan, Jordan, Gaza, and Beirut. We then find a period of him working with the Union Bancaire Privée in Geneva as head of marketing development. He then goes on in 2003 to work for the United Nations in Iraq, obviously a key year in the history of Iraq. And since then, he's held a number of senior positions, both at headquarters in New York and in Angola, Somalia, and the occupied Palestinian territory. He worked for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia as Deputy Special Representative, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator from 2013 to 2015, and then served as Deputy UN Special Coordinator and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon. He was, in the end now, finally appointed as Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He took up his post on the 1st of April 2020. He will be leaving at the end of this week on the 31st of March 2026 after 6 very turbulent and I would imagine exasperating years. I'd like to salute his courage, his indomitable spirit and determination, and of course his ability to stand up for UNRWA and the Palestine refugees UNRWA is mandated to serve. Those of you watching Swiss TV last night, the TSR, will have heard him say that he is not going quietly into retirement. We can expect a book about his experience, and I'm sure there will be continuing contributions in multiple fields. So as you can see, we have someone with a broad range of increasing responsibility across Africa and the Middle East, as well as in entities as diverse as the Union Bancaire Privée, the ICRC, and now the UN. He's coming to the end of his mandate as Commissioner General of UNRWA and will reflect on the particular turbulent period that he and the staff of UNRWA, the refugees of Palestine, and of course others in the region have been going through. In particular, and perhaps this is relevant for this audience and because he's speaking at the Graduate Institute, he's chosen to talk about how international law is not only being violated, but this is done with impunity, and even those states that have historically been vocal in calling out human rights violations, violations of international humanitarian law, violations of UN immunity, have suddenly lost their voices. In turn, we face the disintegration of those rules, and the rules are weakened when nobody speaks out to condemn their violation. Tonight, I'm hoping that he has not come to bury the rules, but rather to urge us that we should not give up. The title of his talk is The War in Gaza, the Future of UNRWA and the Rules-Based Order. Mr. Commissioner General, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the introduction. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Geneva Graduate Institute and to address all of you at the end of my tenure, as you heard, as Commissioner General of UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Before the war in Gaza, not many people outside the United Nations and the Middle East were familiar with UNRWA, and despite its massive regional workforce of nearly 30,000 people, as you heard from Andrew, delivering education, primary health care, social services across the occupied Palestinian territory, but also in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Since October 23, however, UNRWA has become a bellwether for the changes sweeping across the Middle East and the multilateral system that has been in place since the end of World War II. The international commitment to human rights and international law, so painstakingly fostered over 3/4 of a century, is challenged today in ways that dangerously threaten a rule-based international order. Tonight, I want to share with you what it has been like to lead an organization on the front lines of the war in Gaza and under severe attack by the Israeli government and those who blindly support its objective of ending UNRWA. Let me start on October 7, 2023. I was at home when I received the news of the abhorrent attack on Israel. I think we all remember where we were and what we were doing that day. It is impossible to overstate the impact of these attacks and the brutal war on Gaza that followed. The attacks by Hamas on Israel triggered a deep collective and intergenerational trauma. The shock and horror of the massacres and abductions reverberated across Europe, North America, and elsewhere, polarizing societies on the Israel-Palestine conflict. The most intense bombardment of a civilian population since World War II followed, transforming Gaza into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The war had been going on for almost 4 weeks when I visited in Gaza in early November 2023, and at that time I was the first senior UN official visiting the Strip. A total siege had been imposed, and nothing was entering the Strip. People lacked everything. I visited one of our schools in Rafah, sheltering thousands of displaced civilians. There, I met a young girl. She might have been 7 or 8 years old, the same age as my youngest child. She was sheltering in the school in which she used to study. She stood in front of me, begging me for a sip of water and a piece of bread. The despair in her eyes still haunts me. But this was just the beginning of the war. Since then, Gaza has been reduced to rubble. Countless atrocities have been committed. People have been forced to move like pinballs, fleeing death and unable to bury or grieve their loved one. And then, a new law. Despite our outrage whenever famine occurs, our aspiration to prevent it, and despite repeated warnings from food security experts, the Israeli imposed a strict siege and did not allow food to enter into Gaza. Food was weaponized, and hunger spread and deepened to the extent that famine was declared for more than 500,000 people in Gaza City. A man-made famine. To add a layer of cruelty, thousands of starving people were forced to seek assistance at the infamous Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution site. They were nothing else than death traps. Nearly 2,000 hungry people were killed at these sites while desperately seeking food. Finally, after at least 72,000 people were violently killed, and with 1,000 more unaccounted for under the rubble, a ceasefire was declared in October last year. A ceasefire in name only. I say this because military operations have killed more than 650 people since then. As we enter a new phase of the ceasefire, Gaza's battered population has little cause for optimism. The future lies in the hands of the Board of Peace, an unaccountable body that the Security Council has empowered to deal with the future of Gaza. I fear that what awaits Palestinians, it's not a glossy future in the Gaza Riviera, but a state of prolonged misery in which they struggle to survive in a land that is lost to them. Beyond Gaza, the annexation of the occupied West Bank is progressing steadily. Over the last year, Israeli security operations have displaced Palestinians from camps at a level not seen since 1967. Public infrastructure is systematically destroyed, so Palestinians cannot return, and the demography of camps is permanently altered. Israeli settler violence is at unprecedented level and goes largely unchecked, while settlements expand aggressively in defiance of international law. Governments across the world continue paying lip service to the two-state solution, but a political answer to the question of Palestine has never been more elusive. And now let me talk of UNRWA, as we heard from Andrew, a United Nations agency established in 1948 as a temporary stopgap measure until a political solution could be found for the Palestinian people. For decades, Israel has considered the agency a necessary evil. It disagreed with UNRWA's raison d'être, but recognized that it was key to promoting stability among Palestine refugee communities by providing essential services. But this changed after October 7. UNRWA became an unnecessary evil. Eliminating UNRWA became an objective of the war. The Israeli government insists that Hamas is Gaza, Gaza is UNRWA, and UNRWA must therefore be Hamas. All at war. Within 2 months of the start of the war, 130 of my colleagues had been killed. On the 8th of December 23, it was only 2 months in the war, I wrote to the President of the United Nations General Assembly a letter I had never had cause to write in 35 years of working in conflicts. A letter predicting that more of my colleagues would be killed. I knew more would be killed, but not how many. The number of colleagues killed since I wrote that letter has tripled. Many died alongside their children. Many others have sustained life-changing injuries, and many were arbitrarily detained and tortured. During the siege, our staff were not spared. I received many reports of colleagues fainting from hunger while working in our clinic and shelters. And over the last 2 years, hundreds of UNRWA premises in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The Parliament of Israel adopted legislation to end UNRWA's presence in occupied East Jerusalem, including by forcibly shutting schools and health clinics. The UNRWA headquarters was seized, looted, and set on fire, with senior Israeli officials, members of the government and the parliament, celebrating the destruction on site and online. A deputy mayor of Jerusalem called for UNRWA personnel to be annihilated. A well-orchestrated disinformation campaign alleges agency-wide neutrality breaches, including infiltration by Hamas, and claim that UNRWA is no longer operational in the occupied Palestinian territory. These malicious assertions, which have been repeatedly debunked, are intended to erode international support for UNRWA, weakening Palestinian rights within final status issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Looking ahead, UNRWA remains the largest, best established, most cost-effective UN humanitarian and development presence in a region in crisis. It is also a vital resource for protecting the rights of Palestine refugees across the region and addressing the long-standing question of Palestine. Last week, I wrote again to the President of the General Assembly, and I urged Member States to leverage UNRWA's workforce and expertise as key assets for the successful implementation of Security Council Resolution 2803. This would avoid a repeat of the disastrous mistake of removing the entire civil administration in Iraq in 2003, devastating prospect for recovery and durable peace. But without immediate and robust political and financial support, UNRWA will soon reach the end of its viability. This would have immense consequences for the future right of Palestinians, as well as for an already unstable region. It is astonishing that UNRWA, a United Nations agency, has been allowed to be crushed in violation of international law with total impunity and with United Nations staff and Palestinian communities paying an unacceptable price. The gross violation of international law in conflict are not new. What is new is that these violations are no longer hidden. These violations are claimed, committed with pride, like the war trophy selfies taken by Israeli soldiers while destroying schools or while humiliating civilians in Gaza. What is new is a total sense of impunity, that rules do not apply, even if it leads to a new form of barbarism. The fact that these violations have gone unanswered has further compromised international NGOs and media in the OPT, and while undoubtedly compromised humanitarian and human right work everywhere. The event on and after 7 October 2023 have generated seismic changes. We are living in a dangerous and unpredictable times. The abject failure to muster an effective multilateral and international law-based response in Gaza has enabled a war outside international legal boundaries that is now spreading across and beyond the Middle East. It has normalized disdain for the rule-based international order. The Geneva Convention were put in place more than 75 years ago to protect civilian and non-combatant during conflict, a set of rules on which we all agreed. But do we still? Today, the Convention are so undermined that they are at risk of becoming irrelevant. The lack of meaningful action in defense of international law is weakening the foundation of multilateralism with serious consequences. It is fueling resentment in the global south, where many perceive that the values enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in international law do not apply equally, and certainly not when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. International humanitarian law is losing its universality by doing so. Many participants in Davos and Munich this year warned that we are experiencing a rupture of the rule-based order and that a new order is emerging. Even countries that identified as ardent defenders of international law are downplaying its weight, barely concealing that it is applied selectively depending on the accused and the victims. Our leaders in governments are not fighting back. They feel intimidated and powerless. They are failing in their responsibilities by giving into economic or military bullying and threats. We must ask ourselves how we arrived at this juncture where broadly accepted roles and shared value are so fundamentally contested. Back to Gaza. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is revealing a highly concerning deficit of mutual empathy and deeply entrenched prejudice. This attitude has been fostered over decades through competing narratives anchored in divergent beliefs about what triggered the conflict. Narratives that have often been cynically exploited to gain and maintain political power. Today, Israeli and Palestinian are neighbors who no longer know each other, divided by war and growing isolation. It is both tragic and ironic because Palestinian and Israeli share a long and profound history of oppression, grief, and loss that most of us could not begin to imagine or understand. I'm often asked how we should respond to the profound challenges confronting the rule-based international order. Is there a balance to be struck between holding firm to principle and pragmatic accommodation? While compromise is a central tenet of resolving conflicts, I believe that core principles and values cannot be negotiated. For humanitarians, our ability to provide life-saving assistance depends on strict adherence to the principles of humanity, independence, impartiality, and neutrality. We cannot, under any circumstances, be part of efforts that flout this principle by discriminating against people in need of assistance or politicizing human suffering. Wars and humanitarian crises are deeply complex. To navigate them effectively, we must maintain clarity regarding our purpose and be guided by commonly agreed principles. However, this is not enough. We also have an obligation to call out violation of human rights and international humanitarian law, even when it is inconvenient and uncomfortable, even when violations are committed by friends and allies, even when it comes at a professional and personal cost. Archbishop Desmond Tutu reminded us of the moral imperative to act against injustice when he stated that to be silent in the face of oppression is to choose the side of the oppressor. Silence is complicity. so is inaction. My colleagues at UNRWA have spoken out forcefully against the horrors and indignities that Palestinians have endured in Gaza. UNRWA has loudly and repeatedly raised the alarm regarding violation of international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. We have identified this violation as part of a long-standing political project to separate Palestinians from Palestine. Our information has helped to create an evidence base for the ruling of the International Court of Justice. To be vocal is a choice, and in my view, to be vocal is a duty. In conclusion, rising populism and bigotry are a threat to human rights and the rule of law, which underpin our collective security and prosperity. International solidarity around our shared values is needed now more than ever, and each of us has a role to play. The primary responsibility for addressing humanitarian challenges and political crises lies with member states, all of which are obliged to uphold international law. But where quiet diplomacy and public expression of concern and condemnation, we are very good at that, by the way, fail to influence the actions of a rogue government, alternative measures should be considered. This measure range from political, diplomatic, and economic sanction to legal action. In the context of Gaza, it is imperative that we reject attempts to undermine and marginalize the United Nations and other humanitarian actors. We must also demand a political pathway that safeguards the right of Palestinians and finally addresses the question of Palestine. There is no doubt that these are dangerous and unpredictable times, but we do not have the luxury of despair and inaction. We must act, not belatedly, but now, to mobilize a broad coalition genuinely committed to uphold international law and to defend multilateralism. We must persist in a vigorous defense of our common humanity and shared value. And maybe just on a personal note to end, I have been, over the last few years, of course, inspired by our staff in the field, but I have to say that without the support of my family, my children, who are all here, Dalva, Chiara, Annabelle, Alexander, and my wife, Antonia, I would certainly have given up a long time ago. So, thank you.
Thank you. That was a magnificent tour de force, sounding an alarm, I think, not just about the way UNRWA has been treated, people in Palestine have been treated, but also the threat, as you said, to the multilateral system and what you called here the rules-based order. We will have a sort of brief conversation now, and then afterwards two students will come and put some questions to you, which will be perhaps more pointed. But I wanted maybe to pick up something that you ended on, which was how UNRWA was reacting or interacting with the International Court of Justice and with the courts generally. Because I think we all heard very clearly your frustration with states failing to condemn the violations, but as many people here know, in the end, the attacks on UNRWA did go to the International Court of Justice, and you did succeed in getting a ruling saying that Israel had violated the UN Charter and that there must be no starvation and all the other things that they called for. Was that frustrating to know that you were going to get your day in court, the judgment comes, and still no progress?
There have been different steps. The first ruling was an emergency ruling from the International Court of Justice after the South African submission, and basically ordering the state of Israel to facilitate humanitarian response to avoid a situation of famine, and a situation which, at the end of the process, because of the demand of South Africa, that Israel could be accused of genocide. But this provisional measure have never ever been respected. I think the first one came in January 2024. We had a very short ceasefire. At the time, there was a release of a few hostages, but then a very strict siege was reimposed on Gaza. So in total defiance of the International Court of Justice provisional measure. Then there have been also the General Assembly, which has submitted a case to the International Court of Justice, questioning about the legality of the decision Israel was taking while they were illegally occupying the Palestinian Authority. But that advisory which has been issued by the ICJ was again totally ignored. Now, the problem is not the law per se. The problem is whether yes or not it will be implemented, and if it is not implemented, what are the consequences? The frustration over the last few years is that no action never had any consequence of any kind. There have been discussions in Brussels about the trade agreement, whether yes or not they should suspend it. There were a few European countries pushing for that, but they never ever succeeded to have the qualified majority to impose it. So ultimately, even diplomatically, even ambassadors were not even called for protest, for blatant, I would say, violation. And it's not that we do not know in the context of Gaza. I mean, it was a war under a watch 24 hours in social media. Of course, there is a war of narrative, but we also know that there have been daily atrocities committed.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose I'm curious to know also how you heard the news that the other court in The Hague had issued arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel and now the former Minister of Defense, Benjamin Netanyahu, that they were accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Did that have any reverberation? I mean, or is there some solace from the fact that it was recognized that international law was being violated, at least in that context?
I mean, the issuance of the arrest warrant only impacted the geographical area where Prime Minister Netanyahu and Previous Minister Gallant can move around. But we have seen that Prime Minister Netanyahu has now gone 6-7 times to Washington, received a red carpet, is flying over the sky of a number of European countries. So in reality, it has not really constrained him.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, again, we are confronted in a situation where the court, whether the ICC or the ICJ, are both disregarded, at least by Israel. They would be respected only if they would have a ruling in their favor, but otherwise no way. That's exactly where we are today. Now the question again is, why do our country not stand up? Look even at this country. I mean, we are still the country having the custody of the Geneva Convention. we had a General Assembly calling on Switzerland to organize the high contracting the conference for the high contracting party on Palestine. And we failed. Why did we fail? Because they have promoted the lowest possible common denominator, which obviously was not acceptable for many countries. So I think we are not, I haven't seen, and here's the frustration, any country properly standing up. And there have been a total discrepancy also between the feeling of public opinions and what lawmakers or governments have decided to do.
Yeah, no, we hear your frustration. It's so clear, and I think it's a big signal to everybody that it's not working, but it depends on people standing up, as you say. I suppose just my last thought on what you had said that occurred to me is I was very convinced by the point that you made that it's not about compromising or balancing things, that there are some principles which ought to be absolute. And that somehow people working in this field seem to think that one has to find a diplomatic way forward, you have to consider both sides, one has to compromise. But your point is that these are things that shouldn't be compromised on at all, and still people have not got that message.
You know, within the broader humanitarian community, we keep promoting what we say pragmatism. But there are limits to pragmatism. And I think Gaza has been a very good example. We had, on one hand, the Israeli government saying, well, there is far too much aid diversion, we cannot work with the United Nations that way anymore. By the way, diversion has never been proven. That's number one. So we have to replace them with a new model called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. But the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was set to fail, there is absolutely no doubt. The primary objective was to support political and military objective of Israel to force the displacement of the population. They became death trap, but very quickly there have been a number of countries saying, but we have to partner with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. No, we don't have to partner because we cannot become complicit of the killing of starving people, while at the same time, the main objective of this so-called humanitarian response was to promote and accelerate the cleansing of the population in Gaza. So there are limits when it comes to compromise to keep your operation. If you become complicit of an ethnical cleansing or a forcible displacement of a population, there is nothing humanitarian in that. And we have to accept that we are giving up our operationality, because otherwise you compromise principle you will not be able to implement elsewhere. One precedent, we cannot have a precedent in a bubble or in isolation. Whatever is decided in a context will be replicated somehow, somewhere else.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite now my two students, Zoe and Nada, to come and join you, and I'm going to take a back seat.
Thank you.
Let me, while they're coming up, introduce Nada Hashwe, who's just coming on behind me. She's a master's student here at the Graduate Institute in the MINT program, specializing in human rights and humanitarianism. Nada comes from East Jerusalem, Palestine, and has more than 7 years of experience working in the field in organizations such as the German Red Cross as a human rights protection officer, focusing mainly on refugee rights, child protection, women empowerment, and integration. Zoe Lazzarini is a PhD candidate at the Institute whose research focuses on the use of armed force in occupied territories. She's a teaching assistant at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and she's previously worked in the legal division of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I'm now going to hand it over to them.
Thank you. I would like to start by telling you about my close friend's dad, who was born in a refugee camp in Ramallah, West Bank, administered by UNRWA services. I told him that we are having a conversation together today, and he shared with me that because of UNRWA, he was able to attend school, learn, and build a future. And his story is not unique to him. UNRWA has truly been a lifeline for Palestinians for 77 years now. However, this was not supposed to be the case, like you mentioned in your speech. UNRWA was first created as a temporary agency to support Palestinian refugees after the Nakba catastrophe in 1948. And currently, with the status quo in the region, including the genocide in Gaza, the increase of settler attacks in West Bank and in Jerusalem, the closures and checkpoints, but also externally, the mass displacement in Lebanon and the recent developments in Syria. Could you please tell me how the organization has adapted its strategy and priorities throughout the years to deliver its responsibilities and operations with no political solution yet in sight?
Thank you. I mean, as you said, UNRWA was supposed to be a temporary organization, but it's a temporary organization which has lasted now for more than 75 years. And if it has lasted for 75 years, it's because of the absence of a political solution. But now the real question is, what if there will never ever be a political solution? Will the international community still be willing to fund an organization like UNRWA? And this is a question we wanted to put on the table before October 2023, at the time we were marking the 75th anniversary. What if, after 100 years, there is no political solution? We knew already after 75 years that there was less and less attention in the region, and geopolitically, other regions in the world started to be prioritized. And the main existential threat for the organization at that time was the financial situation, the discrepancy between what we are expected to provide. We function like a public service provider for one of the most destitute communities across the Middle East, but we do not have the fiscal tools of public institutions. We depend only on voluntary contribution of the member states. But on the other hand, the communities want us to keep absolutely all the services. And if they see us decreasing a service, they see this as a weakening of the future right for self-determination. So UNRWA has been completely locked into this tension. How do we adapt? There is no real solution to this except a political will to consider the agency as an asset, but a political will also to transition. We cannot remain for the next 20, 30, 40 years a kind of a static organization. We need to be part of a political, I would say, framework and process. But the question is, if there is none of them, what will happen? I don't think the agency will be able to survive. We have to start, in that case, to promote social inclusion and to disentangle the question of the provision of services with the question of the right of the Palestinian refugees. The right remains a political issue. The services should be depoliticized. And that's the only way to ensure sustained access to critical services, I believe.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. I would like now to shift our focus also and talk about the attacks on UNRWA. UNRWA has faced numerous attacks of disinformation and intimidation. Israel has accused it of collaborating with Hamas and banned it from operating in its territory. As of 18th of February, UNRWA has recorded 391 UNRWA staff killed in the Gaza Strip. Some of them were killed in the line of duty, while others were killed at home with their families. In the latest attack on UNRWA, in December, Israel bulldozed the headquarters of the UNRWA in occupied East Jerusalem, replacing the UN flag with an Israeli flag. Such unauthorized entry into UN premises and attacks are clear violations of international law. As a UN organization, how can you respond to such attacks by Israel? And could you tell me how these measures have impacted the organization and its staff, but also the Palestinian refugees relying on UNRWA?
There is no doubt that the attack the agency has been under have increased. There have been different types of attack. We had, as you mentioned, colleagues killed, premises destroyed. We have a headquarters seized by Israeli official expressing jubilation with this extraordinary violation of privileged immunity of a United Nations organization. By the way, if it happened to a UN agency, it can happen to any embassy of any member states. And this has not led to more than just words of condemnation. We are also subject to fierce disinformation campaign to parliaments. I have spent a lot of time in parliaments being accused of leading a terrorist organization, an organization infiltrated by Hamas. We have legislative bills against the agency. We have a number of legal cases also against the agency, and all this has impacted the confidence of some key donors. You should know that the main donor, being the United States, has decided to stop the funding of the agency. Beside that, we have also seen in Europe that whenever a new conservative government was put in place, most likely this government would be much more sympathetic to Israel and much less to the Palestinians. So we are very exposed also to domestic politics, and depending on the outcome of election, we know if yes or not, a government will continue to provide the support to the agency. Sweden has been a very good example. It's a coalition with the extreme far right. They have been very strong supporters of the agency for decades, and all of a sudden have stopped. But other governments have resumed because they changed also the composition of the government. So we are very much exposed to this, I would say, domestic dynamic. But the impact, and this is certainly what pains me the most, is that 1 or 2 months before leaving and ending my tenure, I had to take the decision to decrease the volume of the services of the agency by 20%, which means decreasing the salary of 30,000 people by 20%, while they would have expected, after what they have endured, they would be rewarded rather than being in a situation where the salary would be cut. But this is the impact, and after that, the impact on the communities is that, for example, instead of having house school open 5 days a week, they're now open 4 days a week. So it has inevitably an impact on the quality of the services that we are providing.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I would like to just have a follow-up question on this. What do you wish the international community would do about this? So, for example, whoever is in the audience right now, decision makers, scholars, researchers, lawyers, what would you like to tell them?
Well, I'm not used to talk to this audience. I usually talk to some policymakers in capitals. And it is true that, in Brussels, I would really have hoped that that member state would have found a qualified majority to say, we have an agreement, an association agreement between Europe and any country in the world. One precondition is the respect of international law and the Human Rights Convention. They have made an evaluation from experts who came to the conclusion that this is not respected anymore. But despite that, political, I would say, assessment has prevailed, and they haven't been able to reach a qualified majority. And I think we have to work on it. We have to work on the fact that if we do not abide, there should be a price. There should be ways to force country. We know perfectly how to behave with certain countries, and for other countries we just decide not to do anything. And this kind of deux poids, deux mesures, it's not really understood anymore. And this, by the way, polarize or deepen, in fact, the misunderstanding between the so-called Western Hemisphere and the broader global South. And I think we really have to be aware of this.
Correct, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your powerful talk. And despite very clear pronouncements on the illegality of these actions, including by the ICJ, as we saw, Israel has over several decades persistently advanced in establishing facts on the ground. You mentioned the forced displacement of Palestinians, the creation of illegal settlements, massive use of force against Palestinians, extensive house demolitions. And sometimes these facts have even been used by Israel to legally justify its actions. I'm thinking, for instance, the presence of settlers and their security. So how can we effectively respond to the creation of a de facto situation whose effects now seem nearly irreversible?
We talk about the irreversible trend now for some time. I remember when I was posted in Jerusalem in 2008, 2010 in a different capacity, we were already talking about 500,000 settlers. We were also already talking about the fact that there was no geographical contiguity anymore in the West Bank. We were talking about that if we really want to have a two-state solution, you need extraordinary courageous leader, which, well, I have to say, don't exist. And we have a country, an entire country, whose parliament has also clearly indicated that there will be no two-state solution, and there will never be a two-state solution. And today, the mood is not only on a no two-state solution, the mood is more about how far can we extend our land. It's not just the West Bank or East Jerusalem, but we have seen land grabbing now in Syria. We talk about the land grabbing in Lebanon up to the Litany River. If you listen to some member of the government, the most messianic one, they talk about why not to go up to Iraq. It's also part of their discussion. They see, anyway, Jordan as the future state of Palestine. So all this to say that, and I don't know what the reason is behind it, but we keep the issue of the two-state solution artificially alive. It's maybe clinically dead, but we keep it artificially alive because we do not know what the alternative is. Now, it is also true that before October 7, there was a movement within the younger generation of Palestinians in the West Bank who somehow were less interested in the struggle of their parents and grandparents. The struggle of the parents and grandparents was very much a struggle for self-determination and two-state solution. But what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years has been constant regression. No progress, constant regression. So the younger generation say, but in reality, what we are interested in is to have a normal life, equal rights. So the notion of equal rights started to surface. And that's also when people start to say, but if we are talking about equal rights, our struggle needs to shift from our struggle for self-determination to a struggle to end a discriminatory system being named an apartheid system. Now, what is the future? I do not know, but it is clear that every day seems to bring us even further from a two-state solution. Look, even the prospect of Gaza. Gaza is cut off from the West Bank. Since the ceasefire, we have a board of peace. We have a Palestinian committee which has been put in place, which is prohibited to use any Palestinian symbol. It's extraordinary. They are in no decision-making level. They are just at the implementation level. Question is, will this land continue to belong to them if others will decide? Is this a new form of, settlement? I don't know. But for the time being, the prospect of a two-state solution has never been as far as it is today. I remember it was the first time in Gaza in 1990. It was the first intifada. There was extraordinary positive, Haji, we met at the time, there was extraordinary positive energy. People truly believed that there will be a two-state solution, that it's nearing, and then we had Oslo. It was a time where in every Palestinian household, someone was speaking Hebrew, either because they were working in Israel or they were in business relation with Israeli. 30 years later, they don't know each other. They don't even know how they look each other. There is no one below the age of 60 which speaks Hebrew and vice versa. The Israelis don't speak Arabic anymore. They are perfect strangers. And that in a very short period of time.
And perhaps the last
Sorry to be grim.
Perhaps the last question before we open the floor. You already mentioned it, but last year Israel introduced a new aid delivery scheme controlling the amount of supplies entering Gaza at a few specific points, distribution points designated by Israel, and with the involvement of private contractors. Since you observed the implementation of this plan in practice, could you share with us its concrete implications? And although I think we got our answer, could it ever meet Israel's obligations as an occupying power, this scheme?
So the scheme you refer to is it's a famous Gaza Humanitarian Foundation I was referring before. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was something private contractor, mercenaries, Israeli and American, wanted to be put in place to support the effort of the Israeli military. Now, in some, I would say, disinformation campaign, they were talking about large-scale diversion. But I have to say that the previous US humanitarian envoy, Satterfield, never ever heard in any of its conversation with Israeli the word diversion or concern about diversion. So that popped up. At the time they said, we want humanitarian to do what will help us, which obviously was not acceptable for the humanitarian. And what they have put in place were 4 distribution centers. So you have 2 million people, but 4 distribution centers. Whereas before that, we had more than 300 distribution centers, which means totally inaccessible for the most vulnerable one, to start with. Secondly, you will create a large crowd of people, and since they were joint Israeli-American distribution center, they had to be located at proximity of military position. So if you have a large crowd, middle of the war, nearing a military position, it's a recipe for disaster. And within weeks, you had about 2,000 starving people who were killed while desperately trying to seek food for themselves and the family. And you had thousands more who have been injured. There was absolutely no system which was put in place at that time. And indeed, if that's the future of humanitarian assistance, a mix of privatization through military contractor, there is absolutely no room after that to act in a principled manner.
Thank you so much. I think we can take 2 or 3 questions from the public. So perhaps there.
Hello, Philippe. Thank you so much for everything you've done. I think everybody in this room feels a huge respect and gratitude for you. I have one question. I wonder, how do you, when you look at what humanity has been capable of in this kind of atrocity, do you see it as a form of stupidity or a form of psychological immaturity or of some kind of selfish greediness? How do you look at human beings now, having seen this from up close?
I don't know if I have a clever answer to this one, but maybe a few observations. I was struck at the beginning of the war when it was at the time I attended the Paris conference organized by President Macron. And at the same time, more or less at the same time, I was supposed to go to Berlin to the parliament. But I couldn't, so it was a VTC with a parliamentary member of a commission. And I remember during this interaction that I was describing, in fact, the problem of lack of mutual empathy, that trying to describe this deepening polarization people feel for Israeli or people feel for Palestinian, but no one is capable to put its feet in the shoes of the other. And I remember that a rapporteur, said in her intervention openly, I cannot feel anything for the Palestinian after what happened. Whether we talk about babies to be born, women, I cannot feel anything. And I think what she said, the good thing is she spelled it out, because that was something we started to feel was prevailing. But what has struck me the most is this ability of not feeling, which is the beginning of a dehumanization process. Now, where is this coming from? I think it's also partly coming from the fact that we don't know the other anymore, or we are not interested in the other anymore. What I tried to describe before, about Gaza when I was there 30 years ago and where we are today, it's much easier to talk about Gaza, it's a bunch of terrorists, it's Hamas. Look at the extraordinary statement media, journalists, politicians have been able to say. You just deal with situation by considering that people are not human. You might even feel more empathy for your cat or your dog than for the others. And that's quite frightening. There is absolutely no doubt. But this paved the way for this extraordinary cruelty. But it's the same discussion we have about, what is the future of international law. When you hear politicians saying, well, the old order has gone, what does it mean? But what does it mean when we hear from leaders in Europe saying the old order has gone? Replaced by what? Because the alternative is disorder. And disorder is the law of the jungle. At least with the old order, which should be our order, we have a reference. And even if it is disregarded, we can still point a finger at a problem. But if you don't have these rules anymore, what are you referring to? So sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but I'll try to circle.
I'm going to try and make sure there's no fighting over the microphones. So, yes.
Okay. My name's Sayed Moasha. I'm a student here at the Institute. In fact, you lead into the question that I had. Another professor here, Professor Yuval Shavi, wrote a few weeks ago about this idea of the collapse of the rules-based order, but he called it illegal yet legitimate. He said that the silence and complicity, which you also mentioned, is a developing new customary international law, meaning the silence of Europe justifies the actions of a state. I'd like your thoughts on that order that you're talking about that's replacing this. Is this a new customary international law? Or how would you say that argument would be? And he references that the principle of self-preservation. I'd like your thoughts on that.
I'm not in favor of talking about a new order at all. I think we have to resist this temptation. We heard it in Davos, we heard it in Munich, we keep hearing it. I think President von der Leyen, even 2 weeks ago, said Europe will not be the custody of the old order. What does it mean? I don't know what that means. We have to avoid such a situation. In the contrary, we have to reappropriate what the rule-based order has been. That we have, we have invested now decades to agree on norms, value, way of interacting between states. We have to go back to this. I think and I agree also with what you say. I mean, the silence has been very sickening. I do believe that the silence has been indeed kind of a complicity. We said it many times, in fact. I said it at the Security Council, in fact. But the problem is that, and the silence is leading to inaction, to paralyze us. And this is what has fueled this sense of total impunity. There is no limit. The problem also is, if you look at the individual level, if you have a child and you say, I love my child, you give limits. If you do not give limits, you create a monster. And that's exactly what happened. You have no limits. We don't know where this will end.
So there's a woman here and then at the back.
Hello, thank you very much for this very insightful conversation. I want to follow up on the private sector engagement and Gaza Humanitarian Foundation subcontractors. According to my understanding, some of them, like UG Solutions, Safe Reach Solutions, are still operating in Gaza, not under Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but as themselves. And I also read that some of the other tech companies are now under Civil Military Coordination Center, and some UN agencies and some selected 12 states are also coordinating under the Civil Military Center. So my question is that, do you think that this is the new equilibrium where private sector is already there and it's gonna be there, and if that's the condition, I wanna ask about your opinion, because I've also heard you saying that principled action is not possible with these military companies.
You know, you raise an important question. The question is, what will the future of Gaza be? Now, we had a version being presented in Davos, this kind of futurist Riviera. And if you look at this, I mean, it means that Gaza won't belong anymore to Gazan. At best, Gazan will become citizen of second or third category. The one who will stay there to serve those who could afford to buy this, I don't know, this new Dubai, Riviera, or whatever. It's a kind of, it's a totally dystopian vision. What you are referring to about this tech company are the so-called, how do they call it? They talk about having communities of Palestinians for 25. So what? The alternative safe communities, cash-free community, so we can basically follow up every interaction, every purchase. You would need an authorization whenever you want to go out of your community. That's basically what's being proposed. Now, is this really the future of Gaza? It would make me feel to a kind of adapted version of the Uyghur in China, or an adapted version of the Indian of America 200 years ago, but adapted to the modern time. Can we be part of it? I mean, when I say we, UN organization or humanitarian organization, no, we can't. Now, is this the direction which will be taken? I don't know. Some might wish to push for that, but we have also to resist or prevent the temptation to go in this direction. So right now it's very murky. There is much less attention also because of the latest event in the region. A few weeks ago, some thought that the Board of Peace would kick off. We heard a commitment from countries like Indonesia saying we are ready to send troops to build up the rule of order and so on. But since the war has started in the region, they have pulled back and basically indicated that they won't be part of the Board of Peace anymore, and that they're not ready to provide their forces. So where will this go? I don't know yet. I also believe that the involvement of the Gulf country might be reviewed now. They made it a priority before the war in Iran, but now, having been so heavily impacted, they might also have lost interest. That's something definitely to be looked at.
There's a woman who's been very patient there. Did you get the microphone? You've got it. Okay. Very
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for being here and for all your work. I'm a human rights second year student, and I wanted to ask you about the state of education in Gaza, how it's going to look in the future, how it's being rebuilt, and also how it compares to previous wars that there have been and to previous reconstruction. Thank you.
Education.
I mean, it's a total disaster, let's be clear. We have 1 million children or people below the age of 18 in Gaza. They live in the rubble. They are deeply traumatized after these 2 years. But before they had a war in Gaza in 21, if you remember, they also went through the COVID. So I would say over the last 6 years, it has been a total disruption. Now, education has always been the pride of the Palestinians. It's the only thing which has never been taken away from them. Houses, land have been taken away, but not education. Why? Because education is immaterial, but is also the key for a better life. We are risking to lose an entire generation. There is no doubt about this. And if we don't make education a common priority, this will contribute to sow the seeds for more radicalism, extremism in the region. People won't have anything to lose anymore. And I think we are not aware enough of that. And the same start to apply also for the West Bank. The brutality and the violence occurring in the West Bank also is severely impacting education. And now we have also the war in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, people are already experiencing the brutality of extreme poverty, because Palestinian Lebanon depend only on UNRWA, because they have no access to the labor market. They are quite discriminated. So I think the people in Gaza will not recover as well as they used to recover from previous war when it comes to education. And that's definitely an area which, you know, again, I think member states, donors have been too shy on this. They have considered the humanitarian response through the narrow lens of food distribution. Nothing else. But not even public health, through the narrow lens of food. And that's also how Israel succeeded to make believe a number of countries that UNRWA is not operational anymore, because we cannot bring food convoy anymore in Gaza. But we still have 12,000 people who are daily working on public health and also, as much as possible, on education. But you can imagine education in this kind of environment. It's not a proper education.
There's a woman here in white who was very patient. Just here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. International humanitarian law violations are brought to light when there are those in Gaza or anywhere who can speak out about them. Today, no international journalists are allowed in Gaza. Palestinian journalists are regularly systematically killed. Israel is trying to silence UNRWA and describing what it sees on the ground. I work for Médecins Sans Frontières, and NGOs like ours have had our registration to work in Gaza not renewed, but perhaps in a bid to try and silence ourselves, try and silence us likewise. Do you worry that in Gaza or anywhere else in context where this occurs, that in the future, where there is international humanitarian law violations, perhaps will go unspoken about. Basically, areas like Gaza will go dark, so to speak, when Israel's efforts to continue to silence all of these people, to speak out about them, continues. Thanks.
Sure. There is definitely a trend of this nature, which we can see in other conflicts. I think it could be also applied in places like Sudan, I would say. Now in Gaza, it's extraordinary that for more than 2 years, no international journalist has ever been into Gaza independently, because the only international journalists who went into Gaza were the one being embedded within the Israeli army. So that's not independent journalism. But by doing so, it allowed them also to, to have a kind of war of narrative. You cannot trust the local journalist because they are Gazan, and since Gaza is Hamas, Hamas is Gaza, we cannot trust them. Now, they have also tried to constrain as much as possible humanitarian organization. And anyone who started to be vocal started to be PNG'd. We notice it with the UN, we notice it with the international NGOs. And today, the new regulation that they are trying to impose on NGOs is not just the issue of informing about who works, who doesn't work with a given organization. I truly believe that the main issue is tone down your advocacy. Stop speaking. Just do and implement. I was prevented to go to Gaza since January 2024. It was exactly at the same time when the ICJ was issuing the ruling by using information that we have provided. That was clear. But even in their demand today with the 37 NGOs who were resisting, and now there is a period of, how do we call it, a period of grace, we'll see. One of the key demands is tone down your advocacy. So yes, because the more you tone down, the more you can counter, you promote your own narrative and undermine the remaining one coming from Gaza. And that's exactly what is happening. And we need this because the primary target of all this narrative are public opinion in Europe or in the States, and primarily parliaments. The most important are parliaments, because they know decision will be taken by government depending on the level of pressure there will be from the respective parliaments.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippe, for not toning down your advocacy tonight and giving us a fantastic insight into your experience and your insights on what is happening. I think it's been a remarkable evening, and I'd just like you to join me in thanking him and our panelists.